Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Short stories. Story title, World's End. "Parking orbit completed, Captain," Sulu stated. He glanced over his right shoulder at Admiral James T. Kirk, who nodded brusquely. "Report, Mr. Spock," the captain said. "Life forms detected, Captain. A few score, as my guess, no more, and deep down." The Vulcan turned to look at Kirk. "May I remind you, Captain, we must report to Base 4 in 3 days' time." "Yes, Spock, I know," Kirk said patiently, then grinned. "But how often do you find a world completely covered by a building hundreds of stories deep and abandoned?" "Never, sir, as far as the library reports. It is a unique situation, but we still must get the medicines to Starbase 4. "We have 30 hours leeway, Mr. Spock. I propose a few hours exploring this unique situation. Is there any indication of its species origin?" "None detectable from space, sir. The construction is standard. It seems to vary from 300 to 700 feet deep. A strong but not unusual steel alloy was employed. The variation in depth might indicate an underlying terrain. The outer surface is varied with starship locks, domes, towers, and other unremarkable markings all over it. Logic indicates a highly developed industrial world which has been abandoned or devastated by some plague. I do not suggest exploration, Captain Kirk." Spock, Kirk said with amusement. "A mystery world, and you don't want us to unravel the mystery?" "May I remind the captain of the necessity to arrive on time at Base 4? Yes, but none of the ships will be leaving to distribute their cargoes to the Moradane system until all the Federation ships arrive with their cargoes. There are 4 others beside us, Mr. Spock. Collateral vaccine from Regulus aboard the Hood, Triosphal and Megathormal on the Republic. The Stephen Barnes has the biotines and the medical assault teams. The Tajari has the Manoprophine, I believe. None of these things is effective without the other. We have time, a little time. I'm not being irresponsible, am I?" He said it with a smile, and Spock raised his eyebrows. "No, Captain. It is my duty to remind you of such things." "It will be noted in the log, Mr. Spock. Now, would you care to accompany me down to the surface?" Spock nodded, and Kirk looked at the young Russian Chekhov. "Mr. Chekhov, you have the con." Kirk punched the intercom. "Dr. McCoy, meet me in the transporter room." "Sir, the transporter beam is set for the 6th level down, which is the first section sealed against vacuum," the transporter officer said. "Air is good?" Kirk asked. "We sent down a scoop, sir, while you were on the way from the bridge. The computer reports it within defined limits of breathable atmosphere for humans, and Vulcans too, Mr. Spock." Spock only raised an eyebrow. Dr. McCoy entered briskly. "What's going on, Jim? I have a couple of crewmen in sickbay who—" "Anything critical, Bones?" "No, an allergic reaction to some Coridan Melbar. God only knows where she got that. And a good old-fashioned case of Centaurian flu." "Dr. Chappell can handle it, then." "Yes, of course, but—" "Prepare to go ashore, Dr. McCoy. That is your kit bag, isn't it?" "Yes, Jim, and a Mark IV Feinberger, too, but—" "Lieutenant Collins?" "My men are ready," the security officer reported. "Where's Bradley?" "Sorry, sir," the young engineering officer said as he ran into the transport room. "I was helping Commander Scott recalibrate the 313 logistics circuit, and time for some hands-on experience, Mr. Bradley." At Pat Bradley's puzzled frown, Kirk smiled. "I have a habit of using archaic phrases from the dawn of the age of technology, Mr. Hands-on. Practical experience, not text tape theorizing. You'd be amazed at the difference. Would he, Mr. Spock?" "Yes, Captain. Reality is often more complex than theorizing. Nothing is as clear-cut and precise." "You just hate that, don't you, Spock?" McCoy said with a grin as they climbed onto the transporter stage. "I accept, Dr. McCoy, that is true. It makes for interesting variations." "Ready?" Kirk asked. "Energize." The landing party shimmered as the transporter beams scanned their bodies. They glittered and vibrated and were gone. The space they materialized in was large and desolate and bitter cold. There was a mist of frost on the blotched metal walls. It had once been some kind of manufacturing area, with blocks and raised platforms all about, with bolt holes and rusting freeze-lock pediments where machinery had once been attached. "Scouts out," Kirk ordered, and 2 of the red-jacketed security men moved ahead and 2 dropped behind. In the main party were Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Bradley, and Tom Collins, the security lieutenant. They moved into a corridor, bleak and cold, and Spock consulted his tricorder. "Life form readings this way, Captain." They went down a ramp, turned along a passage, and down another set of stairs. Deeper and deeper they went, passing through airlocks and rusting hatches. It became progressively warmer. They went down a non-functioning escalator and stopped. "What conclusions have you drawn, Mr. Spock?" Kirk asked. "By the width of the passages and the height of the steps, I calculate a large species, on the order of 3 meters, or about half again the usual humanoid size. By the placement of controls, I estimate large 4-fingered hands. You'll notice that decorations, button placement, and architectural design is on multiples of 4. Common enough. Humanoids with their 10 fingers base everything from mathematics to games on 10. "Hostile or friendly?" Kirk asked. "Unknown, Captain. Insufficient data. I would say they were perhaps bureaucrats." McCoy raised his eyebrows. "How do you determine that?" "A world covered with a building indicates a highly centralized civilization. They are technological, of course, and quite sophisticated in that way. But you'll have noticed the near absence of artistic decoration, methodical minds, and perhaps even hive-like." "Logical?" McCoy said with a faint smile. "Logic dictates a rational approach to goals, Dr. McCoy. Just as the eye needs resting places amid chaos, so does the mind. Art in its many forms are resting places for the intellect, Doctor. Therefore, even the illogical products of art serve a logical function. Do you have any other comments, Dr. McCoy?" McCoy flushed and shook his head. Kirk said, "Hive-like, Spock? Like bees, ants, rhinothrax, and so on?" Spock nodded. "It's possible, Captain. With an average depth of 3,500 feet and the estimated size of the world beneath, I would say the volume of the buildings is large enough to cover North and South America with a building 9 stories deep." "Whew!" Lieutenant Collins said in amazement. "And a few dozen life forms?" McCoy said. "It's virtually a dead world. Let's hope whatever caused it to be deserted is not still here." "We have 29 hours left, gentlemen," Kirk said. "Shall we continue?" They were down 14 floors before they encountered any sign of life. It was on a tattered strip of cloth. McCoy's Feinberger detected harmless bacteria, but it was the first sign of any life. 2 floors down, they encountered the first life form, a rat, not exactly a Terran rat, but a rodent-like creature the size of a mouse, gray and scaly. It scampered away into the darkness out of the exploring party's lights, humming rather than squeaking. The next life form was something more substantial, a genuine inhabitant. "A moment, Captain," Spock cautioned, looking at his tricorder. "I detect something ahead around that corridor. There was a flicker of movement, and even as phasers were drawn, a pale ray enveloped them. The men grunted as they fell. Spock was the last to fall, and his phaser's beam caromed off the metal walls as he fired. There was silence. The lights lay on the metal flooring, canted and making strange shadows on the wall. Then something moved slowly out of the darkness and crept closer. A 4-fingered hand reached through the light beam to tug at a body. Slowly, the body was pulled out of the tangle of limbs and dragged away into the darkness. Mr. Spock had been selected. Kirk flipped open his communicator. His head ached, and he felt stiff and twitchy, a reaction of his nervous system to whatever had downed them, McCoy had said. He was bandaging the bleeding cut on one of the security women's head. "Enterprise, come in, this is Kirk." He stared at the device moodily. "How come there's never a starship around when you need one?" "Collins." "Yes, sir." The lieutenant was right at Kirk's side. "Report." "Except for Kuntz's head, everybody is all right, barring headaches. Mr. Spock has disappeared. We've scouted the immediate area and detect no one. Mr. Spock's tricorder is gone too, sir." "Collins, give Kuntz a message and have her climb back to where the communicator can penetrate all this metal. Report to the ship what has happened and that we are proceeding deeper. Have 2 assault teams in full armor beam down. Tell them we'll leave a 410 radiation trail for them to follow." The trail of breadcrumbs, Collins grinned, then sobered. Yes, sir, at once. Spock came to slowly. He was being dragged along by one leg, his head and body bouncing over trash and distortions in the middle floor. He could barely see the creature who was pulling him along as casually as a child's wagon. If they went down some stairs, the Vulcan was not sure he would survive. He moaned loudly to attract attention and faked a limp posture. The creature stopped and looked back. In the dim light from a wall lamp, the first he had seen, Spock made out the hulking giant who held his ankle in a grip of steel. There was some satisfaction in noting that he had diagnosed the approximate size. The thing was about 3 meters high, but not humanoid. It was barrel-shaped, with long, thick, powerful arms. It was bipedal, but not humanoid, for the thick legs were like those of an elephant. The head was large, tapering to a thick snout, not unlike an anteater. It was hairy and gray-green and had small, suspicious eyes. It did not look friendly. Spock groaned again and feebly moved his limbs, faking a weakness. The response was more than Spock expected. The creature picked him up as easily as a baby and slung the Vulcan across its broad shoulders. Spock struggled, but the huge creature simply pulled Spock around and struck him in the side of the head, then reslung the limp body of the Vulcan over its shoulder. Kirk's team walked deeper and deeper into the world-spanning building. Every few feet, or at every turning, Collins drew on the metal walls with a low radiation device, leaving a trail invisible except under ultraviolet light. "Come on," urged Kirk at every hesitation. "Spock may be in trouble." "Mr. Chekhov, a communication from the surface," Uhura said. "Chekhov here," the young Russian said, thumbing the switch. "Commander, this is Kuntz, Corporal Natasha Kuntz. I have a message from Captain Kirk." Chekhov listened to the message, his face tightening with concern. "How many levels did you have to climb to get us?" he asked. "Up to the 11th, sir. This metal must be more dense than it looks." "Establish a command post there, Kuntz." Chekhov thumbed another stud. "Security. 2 combat teams on the double. Full battle gear. Prepare to be beamed down at once. Mr. Spock is missing. Beam in on Corporal Kuntz's transmission." Chekhov signed off and stole a concerned look at Uhura. They exchanged meaningful glances. They had been there before, but both were fully aware that this time might bring disaster to their friends. Uhura smiled reassuringly. Chekhov looked at the screen. They were holding stationary over the turning metal world, right over where Kirk and his team had penetrated the vast structure. Would the world become an immense tombstone for Kirk, Spock, and the others? Spock regained consciousness lying on a slab. It was cold in the room, but all Vulcans can bear up under cold better than most humans. He looked around as another part of his mind checked over his body. Headache. Bruise on side of head, otherwise unharmed. Equipment check, still clothed. Communicator still in belt, but both phaser and tricorder gone. Spock sat up. Had he lost the tricorder while being dragged? The phaser he remembered in his hand as he was felled under the pale beam, undoubtedly dropped at that point. He pulled out the communicator, but as he suspected, all he got was static. He replaced it and looked around. Bare metal room with high ceiling, wide tall door, no furniture but a slab jutting from the wall opposite the door. Blank, smooth area on sidewall, no visible controls. Head pounding, Spock stood up. He blanked out the pain and crossed to the wall. He pressed the wall all around the smooth area, but nothing happened. "Activate," he said. Nothing happened. "Start. Begin. Open." He quickly ran through similar commands in several languages of the Federation, then in Klingon, Romulan, and Sarcanaflex. No response. Spock thought a moment. Perhaps it was not a screen, but he had no idea what else it might be, as it was not reflective enough to be a mirror. It might be one way, a kind of sign or calling device activated from the exterior. He turned his attention to the large door. There was a cross-shaped knob suitable for a four-fingered hand, but it would not turn. Spock walked to the slab, sat upon it cross-legged, and started to meditate. The gray corridor opened into a vast hall, and Kirk heard scampering across the great space, echoing sharply. A few hums and scratchings, and then silence. Beams from the lights of Collins' team swept the room. It was a vast, bowl-shaped room with a raised center platform and skeletons, hundreds of them, some whole in clusters, some broken and scattered. Where breaks had happened, the bones were almost shattered into dust. "Look at that," McCoy said, pointing to a nearby skeleton that was virtually whole. The structure was immense, more than 9 feet long, with thick, sturdy legs and hip bones. A great jawbone sagged open beneath a skull like a bison, but with a long, sharp, beak-like protrudence. Its only garment was the fragile, dry, rotting straps of some kind of harness. There were no weapons, no sign of why the creature had died. "Are these the inhabitants, or invaders, or pets?" Kirk asked. They walked toward the center of the room, a vast graveyard full of unburied bodies. Here and there they saw smaller skeletons, almost as big as a human, but compared to the adult, whatever they were, they had to be children. They crossed the room and continued a short distance. Then Kirk called a halt. "They could have taken any number of turnings," he said. "We could get lost ourselves except for the trail of crumbs." "Captain," Pat Bradley said, "could I make a suggestion?" Kirk gestured for him to go on. "Someone or something took Mr. Spock. He must have had a reason. Why him? Why not you or me or one of the others? He was the only Vulcan, sir." "You may have something, Bradley. Spock was the last to go down. I saw him out of the corner of my eye as I passed out. Perhaps that attracted whoever or whatever took him." "Sir, I hate to say this, but there could be cannibalism here, sir," Collins said. "Place like this, no sign of food growing? We know there are some people here. At least something's alive here." "A distasteful but logical thought, Tom. All those bones." "They weren't eaten, Jim," McCoy said. "At least not by carnivores or omnivores. Bugs, maybe, ants, that kind of thing. No teeth marks or limbs torn off." Kirk gave an involuntary twitch, and he wasn't the only one. "No, they died from something non-violent and just rotted away." "Perhaps that is what killed off the original inhabitants," Bradley said. "Sir, Mr. Spock thought this might be a bureaucratic world, a kind of star center." Kirk nodded. "Then there would be ships coming in from all over, perhaps even from new planets." "There were no ships in the docking spots outside," Kirk mused. "All gone, indicating perhaps that the survivors fled." McCoy moaned. "Spreading the disease everywhere." "People in fear of their life don't always think rationally," Kirk said. "Good theory, Bradley, as good as any." Sir," one of the nearby security men said, does that mean we might get whatever it was?" Kirk looked to McCoy. "Perhaps. Some microorganisms can last a phenomenally long time, but my guess is that it does not. However, if there are survivors, it must mean that they are either immune or have some kind of protection, in which case we could get it from them." He looked at Kirk. "Or Spock could." At the first sound of someone at the door, Spock's slanted eyes popped open. The metal door squeaked open, and the creature who had captured him stood there, or at least a genetic duplicate. The great gray-green creature barked a command in a language Spock did not recognize, but the gesture told him enough. The lean Vulcan rose from the protruding slab and walked out the door, past the towering hulk of his captor. In the corridor were 2 other of the creatures. Each had a harness of metal links from which hung a squarish weapon of some kind and a short sword. They flanked Spock and started off down the passage. It was a maze through which they passed, a series of rusting rooms without much ornamentation or comfort. Spock saw improvised beds and fires tended by ancient bent figures, older duplicates of his captors. He saw no children, or any less than full-grown alphas, as he had named them. At times, their trail led through rents in walls, blackened holes blasted through in some ancient time. They skirted a great dark well so vast he could not see the other side. Here and there on the walls or ceilings were dim lights, just enough to navigate by. It was a dreary, dead place, unexciting, without, Spock thought, the austere grandness of Vulcan habitations. It was a worn-out world, with a weary, worn-out population, gray and shabby. Then they came upon a great hatch, upon which was crudely welded a kind of shield. There were symbols on the shield, concentric circles, a bar with a disc at one end, and what Spock took to be a 4-winged bird. The concentric circles seemed to Spock to be a representation of the multi-layer structure which covered the unnamed planet, but the other symbols' meanings he could not interpret. The hatch was guarded by two of the gray-green alphas, each with a rod of metal sharpened at one end. They tugged on the hatch manually, and it creaked open enough for Spock's guards to squeeze through. At once, Spock was assaulted by a great variety of sensual stimulants, warm, moist air rather than the cold, dry, tasteless air outside, bright light tending toward red end of the scale, the sound of stringed instruments playing atonal music, and smells unlike any he had experienced. What he saw was a vast, low-ceilinged chamber populated with circular gazebos, round, shiny, metal balls the size of a room. Discs set a foot or so off the floor, which was carpeted with groupings of round, shiny, wet-looking rugs. And in and about these objects were about a dozen creatures of a totally different genetic heritage from the gray-green hulks who had brought Spock there. They were vaguely reptilian about the face, but their bodies were almost cat-like, sleek, and supple. They had tails with tufts of hair at the end, and the hair was treated differently by each of the creatures, braided, fluffed into fuzzy balls, oiled and shaped into glistening spirals, and so on. All the creatures wore jewelry, silver bands carved and jeweled, necklaces of polished metal shapes, earrings of braided wires, belts of linked metal shapes, needles of golden metal glued in sprays around the eyes, and all eyes were unblinkingly upon Spock. Two alphas pushed Spock forward toward one of the new aliens, which Spock was already calling betas in his mind. The nomenclature was simple, usable until real names were discovered. This beta was lying on a pallet of ornamented pillows, and as Spock approached, he or she, the Vulcan could not tell which, picked up a bar with a sphere on top, which started to glow the moment it was touched. Spock was stopped by an alpha on each side, and the leader on the round pallet said something to the Vulcan in a hissing voice. When Spock did not reply, the beta made a gesture, and the two alphas knocked Spock to the floor. The Vulcan science officer lay still for a moment, feigning unconsciousness, and tried to sort out the impressions. A deserted metal world, two very different species, with the physically stronger, the slaves or servants of the other, a few overlords living in luxury upon the labor of the subjected, a dead-end, depleted, autocratic society. And where is Jim Kirk? The alphas yanked Spock to his feet, and the beta leader spoke again, but this time Spock responded. I am Spock, science officer of the United Federation of Planets Ship Enterprise. We have come in peace, and... The beta leader raised the sphere on a rod and pointed it at Spock, and everything went black. Click. No flash, no sound, no fading of powers, just blackness. No sensation at all. Fascinating, Spock thought. Instantaneous neurological disconnection, yet I can still think. Only the input of my senses has malfunctioned. Very little sense of time. I am thinking, and even thinking requires time. Therefore time is passing. I cannot be dead. This is not death. Spock waited a moment, searching his mind for the slightest sign of sensory input, and found none. Very well. I will attempt an analysis of the biological functioning of the betas from information available to me. After that, if the malfunctioning has not ceased, I shall run the paradoxes of Nom Creole. Actually, Spock thought, this is a most unusual circumstance, one to explore. An electronically induced state of nothingness, a powered meditation. Having determined there was nothing he could do to change a state of being, Spock decided to employ it. Kirk held up his hand. Ahead of him, the security man serving as scout had given him a warning sign, then motioned them closer. Around the angle of a corridor, Kirk saw a lumbering creature, gray-green and hulking. The alien went into a room, and from it, Kirk saw a flickering fire. They crept closer, and Kirk could see a bent figure sitting by a fire with the other figure standing nearby. The fire itself was of interest. Raggedly torn sheets of some carpet-like material glowing fitfully but not actually in flames. Kirk motioned them back. As they started to retreat for a conference, one of the security men scuffed his boot on some of the grit on the floor. With a roar, the gray-green giant rushed out, a terrifying figure 3 meters tall. 3 stun beams hit him at once, and the Hulk fell across Pat Bradley with a crash. Immediately, Tom Collins rushed into the firelit room and hit the old creature with a stun beam. He carefully laid the bent figure out flat, then returned to help Bradley to his feet. "Captain, look!" one of the security men said. There was a well-defined path through the grit and rubble, out of the room through a hole smashed in the wall. On the edge of the ragged tear in the metal was caught Spock's tricorder. "This way," Kirk said at once. "Tom, tell the follow-up teams where we're going." "Yes, sir," the security lieutenant said, riding across the metal wall with the marking beam. From blackness to full sensory awareness in an instant, sight, sound, smell, everything returned at once. It was like a blow to Spock's mind, but he immediately attempted to reorient himself. He was lying on the round carpets before the Beta leader's platform. Seconds or hours, Spock wondered. He saw the reptilian head of the leader pull back and the mouth hiss open. Astonishment, Spock noted. Perhaps other life forms recovering from sensory deprivation are disoriented, perhaps even mad. Shall I attempt to feign insanity? Negative. Without a speech common to us both, the creature could not distinguish madness from coherent communication. Body language, perhaps. Spock rose unassisted and stood with an impassive expression, dignified and aloof. The reptilian creatures looked at each other, their tongues twitchy and their hooded eyes watching him. Tails swung back and forth angrily. The leader gestured, and a graceful Beta rose from the nest-like confines of one of the spherical structures and brought a silvery cage to the leader. He pointed, and the Beta took the cage to Spock. He could see within a small bird-like creature. When it fluttered its wings to maintain its balance on the perch, he could see there were 4 wings. The Beta opened the cage door, and at once the bird attacked, its beak striking Spock's cheek and biting. There was a stinging sensation, and Spock staggered, a dizziness momentarily unbalancing him. Then he was all right, and the bird was lying on the floor, its wings beating frantically, then abruptly stopping. All the reptilian-headed creatures shrank back. My body chemistry killed the bird, Spock thought. Unfortunate creature, I apologize, but I cannot change my structure any more than you could overcome your genetic heritage and training. Spock was the attention of all eyes. He saw the short swords in the hands of the Alphas. They began to close warily in on him. Tom Collins flashed his light into the void of the great chamber and could barely make out the dark tiers opposite. This must have been some place when it was working, he said. The accomplishment here was tremendous. McCoy snorted. A monument to bureaucracy. I've always heard the bureaucrats tend to expand their little fiefdoms into kingdoms, but to cover an entire world? That's ridiculous. I wonder what happened to the empire that this might have governed, Bradley said. Maybe there wasn't any, Kirk said as they moved into a dark passage. Maybe the snake of government just swallowed its tail. The governing of the people became the entire society? Asked McCoy. Perhaps. There's no sign of alien cultures here, no artifacts, museums, starships, nothing to indicate outlying colonies. It's monolithic, the end product of bureaucracy. Well, why kidnap Mr. Spock? Bradley asked. Kirk shrugged. Trophy. Hostage. Mr. Spock was the one different from the rest of us, so perhaps scientific curiosity. These great creatures back there, apparently little more than semi-intelligent animals, I would have approached them differently, or it gave us no choice. Sir, asked Bradley, shouldn't we wait for the combat teams? I mean, those critters are big. There may not be time. Spock might be in danger. As the huge alphas lumbered toward him, Spock acted. With blinding speed, he jumped at the nearest of the gray-green creatures and kicked at his sword arm, sending the weapon spinning away toward a pavilion full of startled betas. Spinning, Spock spun on his feet, and his strong kick sent the startled alpha tumbling backward. Out of the corner of his eye, Spock saw the beta leader lifting the rod and sphere. Spock leapt, rolled, and came up with a booted heel, striking at the weapon, knocking it from the grasp of the beta, who cowered back. Spock rolled over and snatched up the rod and pointed it at the advanced alphas, who instantly stopped. Spock felt no trigger, and a quick glance told him there was none on the half-meter rod. But they don't know I can't operate it, he thought, keeping it aimed at them. Now, gentlemen and ladies, Spock said, shall we all just sit down? He gestured with the rod, and after several repeats they all got the idea, and even the hulking alphas sat on the floor. We shall now begin to communicate, the Vulcan said. Hurry, Kirk whispered. The corridors had become cleaner, and they'd passed more rooms, showing signs of habitation, but no more of the big gray-green creatures. Then they saw the great hatch. The two guards fell with a clatter as they were hit with stunning beams from the phasers. There was, to Kirk's mind, no time for niceties, not when Spock might be in danger. They pulled open the hatch carefully. The warm and scented air struck them at once. Phasers in hand, the humans moved slowly and cautiously through the hatch openings. Greetings, Captain, Spock said. Spock! What in the name of sanity are you doing? McCoy demanded. Kirk smiled. Yes, Mr. Spock, just what are you up to? Kirk looked around the huge room, at the gazebos and pavilions, at the platforms and exotic luxury, and at the two alien species seated in arcing rows before Spock. Endeavoring to conduct a class in interspecies communication, Captain. It would have helped had we thought to beam down a universal translator, but I am making do. Indeed you are, McCoy said wryly. A platform had been upended and used as a blackboard, with figures drawn to indicate alphas, betas, and humans, Vulcans, each with a symbol in universal English. The phrases world, state, federation of planets, and democratic government had been written out. Sir, does this violate the Prime Directive? Asked Collins. Rule of non-interference, General Order No. 1, was a wise rule, allowing each culture to develop on its own, thus ensuring variety, strength, and versatility to the intelligent species. But there were many exceptions. One was when the vital interests of the Federation were threatened, but it also allowed for careful and judicious use of action to restore balance. The natives of this nameless world were merely having the social structure of the civilized planets explained to them, and communication was to be established. No, Lieutenant, I don't believe it does. Go back the way we came, stop the combat teams, get a universal translator beam down here, and ask for a volunteer to stay here a while to indoctrinate these people on the Federation. Collins nodded and left at a trot. Mr. Spock, excuse me, Kirk said. Captain? Spock, you were kidnapped, and now we find you the mentor to two species. Would you care to explain? The eyes of both alphas and betas turned curiously toward the captain, then back to Spock. Captain, I have been able to determine the past history of both these species to a certain extent. The larger of the two species are called Pholonix, the smaller, the Granotoluminous. They are the indigenous species of this system, evolving on two planets. The Granotolumines were apparently great organizers, but the Pholonix were not. Gradually, the one took over both planets. The planet and moons of the Pholonix were used as raw material to create this structure, and the Pholonix became a subject species without a home. They never developed star drive, and this civilization fed on itself. Every civilization based on slavery has fallen, sooner or later, Kirk said. The added weight gradually deflected this world from its customary orbit, causing great damage and death. The social structure was so rigid that once the system started to break down, it went very quickly. Disease appeared, and these are the survivors. Decadent survivors, Bradley said. Not quite, Mr. Bradley, Spock said. Explain, Kirk requested. They accepted the situation. Too few in number to rebuild their shattered inner empire, they accepted things as they are. Their fate, McCoy said. In a way, Spock replied. They are natural bureaucrats. To them, fate is a naturally achieved goal of completion. To them, life had an order, a progression. But they had a slave species, protested Pat Bradley. The Pholonix evolved on a planet farther from the sun, I would guess, and the colder outer passages were more comfortable than in the overheated quarters of the Granotolumines. They each provided services to the other. McCoy said, Together they are waiting for the end. Again, not quite correct, Dr. McCoy. They awaited the completion of the cycle, the process of order. They have accepted our entrance into their lives as a transition to another level of progress. They're amazingly good students, eager to learn, adaptive, and orderly. McCoy groaned. And bureaucratic. Perhaps, Doctor. but logical too, if not imaginative. Any effort of importance requires discipline and order. They have it, both of them. Bradley spoke up. Mr. Spock, they're so... He could not seem to find the words, but his tone told Spock much. Mr. Bradley, to them we are ugly. You see, on one hand, a reptilian-like appearance, and in human cultures the reptile has always been a phobia. You see in the phalanx great hulking beasts out of some children's horror story, ogres in dark metal caves. But to both these species we are hairy, fragile, puny creatures with an incomprehensible desire to wear clothing in a stable environment. Bradley appeared chastened, and Captain Kirk prepared everyone to return to the surface to be beamed aboard. "Sir," Bradley said, "may I volunteer to stay?" Kirk looked at him a moment. "Certainly, Mr. Bradley. We'll have supplies beamed down at once. Anything else you'd like?" Could you fix it with Commander Scott? He likes to keep his engine room crew together." Kirk smiled. "I'll talk to Scotty. We'll pick you up in about 2 weeks, standard time." Kirk's expression softened still more. "At least we'll see if you're ready to come back aboard." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Trudging back up to a level where the transporter beam could get them, Kirk asked Spock a question. "What made you think the Phalanx and the Granitolumens were ready for a teacher?" "Logic, Captain. They were highly xenophobic. They attempted to control or kill me at first sight. Yet they didn't. I was taken as a specimen, and they did not kill me when I was totally helpless. Therefore, curiosity was a stronger element than xenophobia. Their fear of anything strange was less than their desire to learn." Spock shrugged. "I merely accelerated that desire by obtaining the upper hand and changing the conditions of the relationship." "You know, Spock, when you explain something, it always sounds so logical." "Does that surprise you?" Spock said, looking at his captain with raised brows. "No, not after all these years. But what does surprise me still is that in the midst of combat, in the middle of a physical or psychic or even telepathic struggle, you can manage to think so logically." Spock's eyebrows ascended higher. "Really, Captain, you should understand that logic is logic, whether it is swift or slow. Given all the facts, certain conclusions are inevitable." "When do we ever get all the facts, my friend?" "Sadly true, Captain. Logic states that experience proves that we seldom, if ever, are in possession of all the facts. Therefore, it is logical to postulate theoretical conclusions based on insufficient evidence." Kirk sighed. "How did I know that would be your response?" "Logic, Captain," Spock said. "Spock, are you smiling?" "Me, Captain?" "No, that wouldn't be logical, would it?" Kirk shrugged, and shot a glance at his first officer. "Spock?" "Looked at from a certain viewpoint, Captain, even humor is logical," Spock said. Kirk stopped walking and looked at his taller companion. "You know, Mr. Spock, you are a never-ending source of amazement to me." Spock looked slightly surprised. Kirk pulled out his communicator. "Enterprise, this is Kirk. Do you read me?" "Enterprise here, Captain," Uhura said. "Prepare to beam us up. We have a deadline to meet." "Yes, sir." "Oh, and put it on the ship's bulletin. Beginning after we leave Base 4, Mr. Spock will be conducting classes and arriving at logical conclusions derived from insufficient data." "Really, Captain?" Spock protested. "Yes, sir," Uhura responded. "May I be the first to sign up?" "Of course, Uhura, and I'm second. Some of us need it more than others." Spock's expression grew sedate again. "That's logical, Captain," he said. Kirk gave him a sharp look, but already the transporter beam was scanning them. There was a sparkling, and the gray metal corridor was empty.